I think it's a much better idea to take that risk than it is to leave that money sitting in your bank account and actively depreciating. Hello. So as you probably already know, we are headed into a recession. How bad of a recession is still up for debate. I think a lot of economists themselves don't know exactly how to predict this type of event, but it's not particularly controversial at this point to say that tough times are probably right around the corner. If you're interested to learn a little bit more about the state of the economy, I'll link some articles below. But today I wanted to talk about how I personally am preparing for a recession and how you can get started as well. So I've basically come up with 5 tips and tricks to improve your financial well-being. The first one is to document your expenses. The second one is to reduce your biggest expenditures. The third one is to increase your income. The fourth one is to invest more wisely. And the last one is to take care of your tribe. So I'll be breaking each of these down further. The first thing that I've started doing that I personally have found a lot of success in is documenting my expenses. I think that this makes my spending a little bit more painful because I have to sit down at the end of each day to list out the places and things that I spent money on. It's almost a bit meditative in the sense that it increases my awareness of the money that I'm spending. I'm not as likely to swipe a credit card without thinking about it or shop online. As it stands now, using this tracking method, I have saved I think up to 50% of my daily expenses, or I've reduced my expenditure by 50%. So I think this habit is actually very beneficial. And I will say that there are budgeting apps that exist out there. For me personally, those apps are still a bit too mindless, and I like to have that more first order of interaction where I myself am looking at my credit card statement and putting it into a spreadsheet. So I would advise you to do that manual process as well. But whatever works for you, I think the key takeaway is to make note of your transactions and increase your spending awareness. Moving on to my second tip, reduce your biggest expenditures. For most of us, our biggest expense is rent. Now, this expense is honestly the most difficult to change, but I've tried to brainstorm some ways in which you can reduce the amount of money that you spend on rent. The first one is to downgrade your living situation. So if you live in an apartment, once your lease is over, move into a cheaper place or terminate your lease early if you feel so inclined, and look for a place that has cheaper rent. The second thing that you can do is change the number of people in your household. So if you're currently living by yourself, consider getting roommates, maybe consider moving in with your significant other, or you could even move back in with your parents. The second kind of area that I find most people spend the bulk of their money, again, second to rent, is food. Obviously, reducing the number of times per week or per month that you eat out is a good place to start. If you're already not eating out a ton, then maybe consider changing the types of foods that you're buying. So staples like rice, potatoes, canned goods, those things tend to be cheap, and so opting for those is a good way to reduce your grocery bill. Shopping at smaller grocery stores like Asian grocery stores tend to have cheaper alternatives also to maybe Whole Foods or some of these bigger name brands. And unfortunately, food is a very social thing, so I myself find it very hard to not go out and spend money when I want to hang out with friends or go on a date. So what I would recommend doing in those situations is, if you're going to eat out, maybe have a few spots in mind that you know are generally pretty cheap. So around me, I have a list of 2 to 3 places where I try to invite people when they want to go out and spend money, because they tend to be a lot cheaper than a lot of other places. There's also an app called Too Good To Go, not sponsored, but what they do is they basically rescue leftovers from restaurants. So consider looking into that. You can get a pretty decent sized meal for $5. So if you need to scratch that itch, that might be a good way to go about that. And lastly, if you're hanging out with friends, consider organizing more events at home. So instead of meeting a friend for coffee or at a restaurant, invite them to your house, host a little dinner. You'll save both of you guys money, which I'm sure your friend will appreciate, and maybe mix up the things that you do on a daily basis. Right, moving on to the third piece of advice, increase your income. Now, I think the two main ways of doing this are increase passive income and increase active income, aka get a second job. I'll touch on both of these, but for now I'm going to focus on active income, so getting a second job. If you already have a job, then considering another job that works around your current hours is a good option. For example, if you have a day job, you might consider bartending at night or nannying, or conversely, maybe you're a barista in the early morning. Those things can help build your income. Additionally, there are a lot of remote jobs that can work on flexible hours. Things like starting a YouTube channel, blogging, managing a social media account. In a way, those things are like starting your own business, which is another way to increase your income, but they don't require you to be in person, unlike bartending or nannying would, and you can set your own hours. The challenge with starting your own business or trying to monetize via blogging or YouTube is that they tend to take a while to monetize. If you get a second job nannying right now, you'll collect that paycheck immediately. If you try to start a YouTube channel, it might be a year or two before you actually get your first paycheck, and that paycheck might not be super big. However, if you start early, aka now, by the time the recession really gets bad, if it gets bad, fingers crossed it doesn't, ideally you will already have monetized by then, and then you're not reliant on your first job, your day job. So if in the event that you get laid off, again, fingers crossed, knock on wood, that doesn't happen, you'll have a second source of income that you can turn to a full-time job, and that again is remote, doesn't really rely on anybody else because it's your business and you're self-employed. Now, my fourth piece of advice is to invest more wisely. Now, this ties into the passive income that I mentioned earlier, although having your own business could also qualify for that depending on what your business is. But this piece of advice is really important for a few reasons. In 2022, the annual inflation rate in the United States was 8%. In good economic times, our target inflation rate is 2%, and we more than quadrupled that last year. Looking forward, it's hard to tell what the inflation rate is going to be in 2023, but the problem is your money is being inflated away if you're not actively investing it in assets that are returning or yielding higher returns than 8%. So if you have a savings account, most savings accounts give returns of anywhere between 2% and 4%. Now, if you're making 2 to 4% returns on an 8% inflation, you're losing up to 6% of your money each year. Actually, I don't know if I did that math correctly, but my point is that unless your assets are returning more than 8% or the rate of inflation, you're actively losing money. Now, this isn't just limited to savings accounts. If you also invest in index funds or government bonds or relatively safe investments, those also don't tend to yield returns that exceed the rate of inflation, so you're probably also losing money in those investments. So what can you do about this going into 2023? Ideally, you'll invest in assets that yield higher returns than 8% or whatever the inflation rate turns out to be this year. Unfortunately, I don't feel qualified to advise you on what those assets or stocks look like, but I can give you some general pointers. If you can find a stock that is performing really well this year that you do research on and you think is going to yield pretty good returns, absolutely go for it. I think it's a much better idea to take that risk than it is to leave that money sitting in your bank account and actively depreciating. You can also invest in assets that tangibly add good to your life. So in boomer days, a common piece of advice was to invest in a house, because even if a house doesn't appreciate over time, although it usually does, you still have a roof over your head. It is adding utility to your life. Unfortunately, Gen Z and millennials can't usually afford a house, so you can substitute that asset for things like a car. And another strategy is to invest in yourself. I personally am doing this. Instead of leaving so much money sitting in my bank account, I have been spending more money on courses that can give me more skills, or I started this YouTube channel and I invested in a camera. Things that I believe will yield returns in the long run that nobody can take away from me. Nobody can take away my experience. I don't think anybody can take away my business from me. So again, instead of leaving that money to depreciate in my bank account, I've been investing it in improving myself and improving my options for the future. Right, and my last piece of advice for how to survive a recession is to take care of your tribe. If anything happens to you, your friends and family are going to be the first people to take care of you. If you get laid off and you can't afford your rent, you might have to move back in with your parents. If you find yourself strapped for cash or just mentally unstable because of the state of affairs, then your friends are going to be the people who care about you and support you and maybe help you out monetarily if they can afford to as well. Conversely, that means that you might be the person who has to help out other people in your family. If your sibling needs to move in with you, or if somebody in your family needs money, this is honestly the time to take care of them, because you don't really know what's on the horizon for you, and making sure that you have those deep and strong relationships with the people who care about you the most is going to ensure that you have a backup plan and a safety net in case things hit the fan and we're no longer as free and carefree as we have been historically in the last decade or so. All right, so those were my 5 pieces of advice on how to survive a recession. Hopefully they helped. If you have any tips yourself, please feel free to leave them in the comment box. Otherwise, if you like this video, please subscribe. And as always, good luck out there.